Now I'm going to show you some tempera paint techniques, but you could also actually do this with acrylic paint. The difference is tempera is a washable paint, and you can usually get it out of your clothes a lot easier than you can a acrylic paint. Acrylic paint turns more into a plastic when it dries, so it is more waterproof. So the first technique I'm going to show you is called dry brush. So dry brush is where you dip your paintbrush into the paint and then you use the opposite side to paint. So you get a little bit of a streaky effect. Your brush is not wet when you do this. So I'm going to dip it into my green and then I'm going to use the other side. So you get kind of like these streaky effects with it, which is kind of neat. The next technique I'm going to show you is called the color pencil technique. Now, part of this is you have to let it dry in between doing the painting and the coloring. So I'm going to paint it and then I'll come back to it in a little bit and hopefully it'll still be dry. So you paint over it and then you use color pencil on top of it. Underpainting is where you paint with kind of a little bit of a watered down paint. Kind of, some people use it to sketch in. And then once it dries, you can paint over top of it. So it kind of gives you a, instead of a plain white paper to color on, to paint on, it gives you a nice solid background. So this is good, especially if you want to do something big like the sky. You can do this, let it dry, and then go back and paint over top of it. So again, once my underpainting part dries, I'll come back to that one and we'll see what happens. Now, in between each of my colors, just so you know, what I'm doing is I am washing my brush off and I am drying it off because you do not want a really wet brush when you're doing this. The next one I'm going to show you is scumbling. So that's where you're going to paint flat like you did here, and then I'm going to use a sponge or a dabber and I'm going to paint on top of it. So I'm going to paint a nice flat color here, and then I will come back to it and show you what happens with my sponge when this dries. The loaded brush is kind of fun because that's where you dip your brush into multiple colors and you paint. So I'm going to dip this side of my brush into red, this side into yellow, and then I'm going to put a little orange on here too. So let's see what happens because I have multiple colors on here. Well, that's kind of neat. So you get a little bit of a streaky effect. Texture is you want to paint it a little bit thick, and this is very similar to what you would do with the oil pastel, is while the paint is wet, use a scratching tool and scratch into it. So I have sticks. You can use the paper clip opened up, which is what I'm going to use. So I'm going to paint it a little bit thicker. And then I'm going to take my scratching tool and I'm just going to scratch into it. And I have all different kinds of scratching tools that you could use. All right, pressure, that's where you push down on your paintbrush to make marks. So what that would look like, let me wash off my brush in between my colors. And remember, if your paint cup gets dirty, really dirty, feel free to get clean water. So pressure is where I am going to put some paint on my brush, and then I'm going to press down with it like this, and that's how I'm going to make my marks. Impasto is really fun. That's where I use a palette knife. So a palette knife is either made of plastic or metal. The ones at school we have are all made of plastic. There's all different shapes. And what you do is you scoop your paint and you paint with the palette knife instead of a paintbrush. So it leaves your paint really thick. This one might be better to do with the acrylic paint instead of the tempera paint. But you can kind of draw into it with the palette knife too. Now, the oil pastel resist is very similar to the watercolor resist. You're going to draw something with oil pastel. I'm just drawing something very simple here. And then you probably want your paint to be slightly watered down. You don't want it to be too thick or you're not going to see it at all. And with a watered down color, I'll do red. Paint over top of it, and the paint won't stick to the oil pastel part as much, so you'll see it shining through just a little bit. And then the same idea goes for a crayon resist. So again, you could do this with a white crayon, but you don't have to. I'm going to do the same small flower just so you can see. And I'm going to paint over it with slightly watered down paint. Ooh, let's water that down a little bit more, just so you can see. All right. Now, this one is very similar to the texture idea. So sgraffito is, that's where I'm going to paint it first. Once it dries, I'm going to paint it a second time, and then I'm going to, while it's wet, use the back of my brush and I can scratch into it, or I can use a different tool. The difference is this one I didn't do anything underneath of it. This one I'm doing it on top of an already dried paint, so you'll see the colored paint showing underneath of it. This reminds me, both of these remind me of scratch art, where you do it with crayon and then you can put black paint on top of it and you can scratch into it. So let's put our first layer of paint down now, and then it should be dry by the time we come back to it. Okay, and then last one is blending. So that's where I place two colors on my canvas, and then I do a dry brush and I blend it towards each other. So let's do, with my clean my brush off first, I'm going to do a little bit of red on this side. Then I'm going to do some blue on this side. And we know that red plus blue should make purple, so I'm going to use my dry brush. And again, you don't want it to dry, so you got to work kind of fast. And I'm going to use my dry brush and I'm going to blend it. You could also blend it on your palette. Okay, so let's go back. So my color pencil one, it should be dry right now, and I should be able to draw on top of it, and I can make a picture of anything I want. But again, it has to be dry. If it's not dry, you're going to end up ripping your paper. And of course, we don't want that. But what's nice is now you have this color showing through, which is very similar to the underpainting concept. So I had this blue underpainting, and now I'm going to paint on top of it. Let's see, I'm just going to paint. Let's just do, I'm going to dry brush on top of it just so you guys can see. So you can see the blue shining underneath of it. Okay, my scumbling, so now I'm going to come back with a sponge. Now I happen to have a big sponge right here, but you could use a smaller one. And I'm going to take a second color and I'm going to dab on top of it. So you still get that orange showing through. And then back to this one, my yellow is almost dry, but what I'm going to do is paint kind of thick on top of it. And then I'm going to use the back of my brush and scratch into it, and hopefully we should see my yellow showing through. Now my paint shouldn't be blending right now because my yellow is dry. So let's see. And every so often you have to wipe off your brush. Now remember, keep your brushes clean. When you go to store them, point facing up. Don't face it up down in your cup, and make sure they are completely clean from top to bottom. And that is tempera and some acrylic that you could also do with this technique.